We kind of casually refer to it as governance. And the idea is that there is one primary board, and that primary board is responsible for the general oversight of the church in terms of accomplishing its mission. And my guess is you probably only partially understand what you've gotten yourselves into. Because making this shift is really a paradigm shift. It's a very different way of thinking, and as a result, a different way of operating than what we have more traditionally done in the Church of God. In the Church of God, we have most of our churches, we have a structure that was actually developed somewhere around the mid-1900s, around 1950. And I'm told it was developed by a Presbyterian pastor, which, I don't know, if you ever look at the Presbyterian structure in Church of God, they're worlds apart. So I've never quite understood how in the world did we adopt a Presbyterian structure, or at least from a Presbyterian pastor. And my experience with that in the 70s as a new pastor was frustration after frustration after frustration. And one of the huge pieces was we had a board of CE, we had a board of trustees, and we had a spiritual advisory council that involved both of those. And usually the husbands were on the board of trustees, the wives were on the board of CE, and nobody knew who was in charge. But the board of trustees figured they were because they controlled the money. And if you control the money, then you must be in charge. And so really most of my ministry at that church, which was a little over 25 years, we were struggling through trying to make structure changes so that we could be more effective in what we were doing. And it was after I got into local church ministry that I began to be exposed to a concept called governance. And specifically, the model of that I work with is called the Leadership Accountability Model of Governance. And it was developed by a guy named John Kaiser, K-A-I-S-E-R. And John has been my mentor in this process. Have any of you had a chance to read the book Winning on Purpose, by any chance? Okay, Pastor Joe's read. If you haven't read that, that'd be a great book for you to pick up. It's not very thick. It doesn't really tell you how to implement it. That's why I had to connect with the author later and figure out, okay, what does this actually look like? How does it work? But it gives you a good foundational understanding of why it's valuable and why it's so much more helpful for the church moving forward on mission than some of the other structures. The concept of governance for a church or a not-for-profit, there are school systems that use it, there are hospitals that use it, other not-for-profits use it. It was really developed by a guy named John Carver and his wife Miriam. But the process that they developed is so intricate and it's so involved that most churches look at it and go, how in the world do we do this? And so John Kaiser took John Carver's model and made it much more adaptable to the local church. Indiana Ministries has been operating with this model for the 10 years that I've been there. And so it's become my reference point. And just as a bit of awareness, it takes 3 to 5 years to kind of figure out how to do it. A lot of times I'm working with churches that are implementing this. They'll bring me in to do an initial training like this. 3 years later, they say, will you come back and do that again? Because they've started to understand some basics about implementation, but they realize they got a whole other set of questions now that they've gotten a rudimentary understanding. So just be aware, it'll take you about 3 to 5 years to figure it out. I'm glad you're recording it so you can put it on YouTube, and in about the 2.5 to 3 year mark, dust it off and go through it again. Because then you go, oh yeah, I remember him say, oh, now I understand how that piece works. Normally I do this in about 2.5 hours, but I told Pastor Joe, let's allow 3.5. Number one, if I'm going to drive that far, let's don't feel like we were hurried. And number two, let's make it where we can interact some. As you have questions, as you're trying to understand a little more of what I'm talking about. You know, one of the problems in talking about something you're very familiar with, you assume everybody else is familiar with it as well, even though they're not. And right now I know that you're not, but I'll just warn you, when we jump into this, I'll probably slide into that, oh yeah, this is kind of old hat kind of thing. So if I say something, you're going, what? Just raise your hand and go, what? And say it again, tell us some more. I don't understand. How does this work? Because today, I want today to be helpful for you.
Amen.
I want you to walk out feeling like you understand some of the basic pieces of what this is going to look like. Because right now, I'm guessing most of you probably think, oh, this is just a slight variation from what we've been doing all these years. No, it's not. It's really a significant change from what you've been doing all of these years. But I think you'll find that as you get into using it and as you understand how to apply it, you'll look back in 3 to 5 years and you'll go, I'm glad we went through that frustration, because this is really helping us in a lot of different ways. During devotions, Pastor Joe mentioned about the anxiety piece. For the last 13 years, I've been working almost exclusively with church boards and with state ministry boards. And here's what I'm finding. There's a lot of anxiety in churches. And I haven't decided if that's because more people who go to church are anxious people, or if churches breed anxious people. I'm not quite sure, the reason why, but I find that a lot of churches just have anxiety. A lot of church people do. And especially when churches go through pastoral transition, the anxiety just goes through the roof. And so what I've concluded is perhaps the number one thing that's most important for anybody in leadership is to be a non-anxious leader. Now, we can make all kind of rationale for that from the scriptures, because they talk frequently about do not fear, do not be anxious. In fact, do you realize that there is one verse that says do not fear for every day of the year? That's how often the scriptures say do not be afraid or do not fear. And Paul talks about don't be anxious, give your anxieties to God. Don't be anxious. But it's so easy for us in life, in church, in ministry, to be anxious about things. And we talk to other people and they're anxious about things. You're located in the state capital for Missouri. Politicians are always anxious about things. We're bombarded with so much from the media, some of which does not even bear a resemblance to reality. And if you're in the media, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that as an insult to you. Your work's probably spot on. Okay? But we're exposed to so much of that. It's almost like there's just this underlying tension and anxiety that exists in our world. And yet Scripture says, God says, I care about you. I care about what's happening in your world. I got it. Don't be afraid. Don't be anxious. Trust me. And I'm finding as I work with churches, leaders in churches need to be reminded of that. Because do you realize if you're anxious as a leader, do you know what happens to the church? Everybody feeds off your anxiety. That's why it's so critical for leaders to be non-anxious presence. Even when things are a little bit shaky or you go through a rough time, take a deep breath. Remind yourself what Scripture says. Remind yourself God's got this. And then operate with the faith that it's going to work out. One of the benefits of being at the same church for 25 years is we went through a lot of changes. And we went through a lot of anxious periods. And after I'd been there about 18 years, you know what I discovered? Every time we get anxious, we come out of it and things are good. And it kind of went like, maybe that's what Scripture's saying when it says have faith in God. That trust Him. Because you go through this in life, and those of you who are a little more my age, you recognize, yeah, you go through this in life, but things tend to work out, and I don't mean in fate. I'm not talking a secular sense like that. But things tend to work out. We tend to figure out what to do next. We tend to get a handle on it. God always comes through.
Amen.
And so it's just critical that we as leaders remember that. I think that's one of the greatest things we can pass on to younger generations. Don't get bent so out of shape over all the things that happen. Because as long as we work together, we work with God, we maintain a good spirit, we take a step by step in faith, then God will guide us. And the next plank we need on the bridge to take the next step across that river or that lake, God's going to provide it. And so we move forward from there. I'm planning on us breaking about 10:45, about halfway through the morning. And so I have set my phone for 10:45. Jim Croce will be singing Time in a Bottle at 10:45. And so real close to that moment, we'll take a break. And we've got all kinds of weight-gaining goodies for you to eat, and a few things that may not put quite as much weight. If at any point you want to get a refill or grab another donut, you need to step out to the restroom, feel free to do that. This is not like first grade where you stay in your desk unless you raise your hand and ask for permission to leave. And I just want to echo Pastor Joe's praise of Jennifer. I walked in my hotel room last night after fighting the rain most of the way from Indianapolis here, and I find this basket that had Diet Dr. Pepper Cherry, which is my drink. And it had snowballs. Those little pink marshmallow with the cream. It had snowballs in it. And 4 hours earlier, I had stopped at a Pilot to get a snowball, and they had none. I walk in my room, and there it is. Thank you, Jennifer. But I thought any administrative assistant who gets that in my room, give her a raise. Give her a raise. You have on the table in front of you a folder that has a place where you can take notes for today. I've given a copy of the manuscript of this as well as some other documents to Pastor Joe. They kind of help figure out how to do some of this. Because one of the critical things is that every couple of years you keep doing this training. Because as you get new people on the board, you will gravitate back to an old way of operating as a board if you are not training new people. In fact, one of the things I do at Indiana Ministries, I've got 3 new board members coming on this year. And so before our November board meeting, we've got board orientation. And I'll be going through this training with them so that they understand how we operate with this kind of governance model. So the worst thing you could do as a church is put somebody on the board who is totally unfamiliar with this and just think they're going to figure it out as you go, because that will not work very effectively. So you want to do ongoing training. What does a church organizational model need to accomplish? Because really that's what you're doing when you revise your bylaws. You're making changes in your organizational model, your organizational structure. So let's back up, let's go to a 10, 15, 20,000 foot level, and let's ask the big question. What's the structure supposed to accomplish? Well, if you are familiar with law, you might know that most states require that you legally incorporate if you're a church, and you have to have bylaws if you incorporate, and the bylaws need to identify membership, voting, and the structure that you follow. So I think a lot of times churches probably have bylaws and structure just to satisfy a legal statute. And I'm not sure anybody's ever really thought, okay, why? Why are we doing this? What's the structure supposed to accomplish? It needs to ensure that a local congregation accomplishes its mission and its vision with an appropriate amount of structure and accountability. Let's break it down. Accomplishes its mission. We're going to take a look at what the mission is in just a moment. Fulfills its vision. Are you aware that vision and mission are different? Mm-hmm. Mission is really the core purpose that you exist for. Vision is more of a snapshot or a video clip of what accomplishing that mission is going to look like in the next 3 to 5 years. For example, if you and I form a travel organization and we're going to take trips to different places in the world, then that would be our mission. It's to organize and take trips together. But the vision is, what's the trip we're going to take in the next 3 years? And so if I announce we're going to Hawaii, that's our trip. All right, then we get some people celebrating. If you like mountains or you like beaches, you'll love Hawaii because it's got a lot of both. And so if I show you video clips, if I pass out brochures, if I have some people come talk about things they like to do in Hawaii, that's vision. But if I say, we are a travel club, that's mission. A lot of times in the church, we're not real clear on the mission. And we're even less clear on the vision. And then we wonder why we drift. That's a lot of the reason. So structure should help us accomplish our mission. It doesn't give us our mission, it helps us accomplish it. And it helps us fulfill our vision with, and this next word's key, appropriate amount of structure and accountability. One of the mistakes I see a lot of churches make when they go to restructure, they'll gather bylaws from other churches. And they always gather bylaws from churches that are bigger than they are. And then they try to implement somebody else's bylaws. Working with one church, they had 25 people in the church, but the bylaws called for 37 different elected positions. They spent the whole year filling positions and never accomplished the mission. They eventually closed, and they probably should have. They existed to fulfill their bylaw positions. That was about it. So you really don't need a lot of positions identified in the structure. You need an appropriate amount of structure, and you want to allow for some flexibility, because the structure that works today may not work so well 5 years from now, but if your bylaws are rigid and too detailed, you get locked into that kind of fixed structure when it may no longer serve your purpose very well. And then appropriate accountability. Do you know that very few churches provide any degree of accountability within their leadership structure? Very few do. And the ones that do, it's normally to the whim of the strongest personality on the church board or in the church. And quite often that's the patriarch or the matriarch. But accountability needs to have some agreed upon ground rules. Otherwise, you don't know what you're held accountable to. And that's why I like the name of this particular model, Leadership Accountability Model. If you're going to do it, it's kind of hard to avoid the accountability piece. And let me tell you right up front, if you shift to governance and you don't do appropriate accountability, it will not work. It will not work. And it's not accountability to whoever the strongest personality is, because sometimes that's the pastor. But it's accountability to ground rules that you agree on in advance. In fact, if I were to summarize governance, I would say it's agreeing on the ground rules and then empowering the pastor to lead within the ground rules, and holding the leader accountable to those ground rules. That's the essence of what governance is. For a church's organizational structure to be effective, there are a couple of key pieces that have to be in place. The first one, there has to be missional clarity, or there has to be clarity on what the mission is. So what's the mission of the local church? Matthew 28, 19, and 20 is pretty clear on that. Acts 1:8, pretty clear on that. There are other passages that talk about that. And the general gist of it is the mission of the church is twofold. One is that it is to win people to a life-changing relationship with Jesus Christ. So it's make more disciples, increase the number of Christ followers. A lot of times when I'm doing a consultation in a local church, when I'm doing interviews with people prior to the consultation, people sign up like 20 minutes with me and they will share whatever they want to share about their church. But a lot of times I'll ask one question: what's the mission of your church? And almost without fail, people will say something to the effect of, is to save souls, is to win people to Jesus. And then I say, when's the last time anybody came to Christ through the ministry of the church? And almost without fail, here's what people do. I remember 5-6 years ago, there was somebody, who was that, who committed their life to Christ through the ministry of our church. Now, if the mission of the church is to win people to a life-changing relationship with Christ, and it only happens once every 5 years, how would you say that church is accomplishing? Not very well, is it? And unfortunately, that's the sad state of most of our churches. It's a rarity. And I'm not talking about coming down to the altar necessarily at the end of the service. I think most people make commitments to Christ in other settings than that. But what about through the ministry of the church, through the intentional ministry of the church? How often does that happen? That's critical. That's job one for the church. And then the second, not only more people who are following Christ, but growing the people who are already following Christ. And so my way of saying it is the mission of the church is to make more disciples and better disciples, or to increase the number of disciples and increase the Christ likeness of those disciples. It's both. It's not either or. If you only accomplish one of those two, you only get 50% on your scorecard. Have any of you ever passed a class scoring 50%? No. In fact, that would be a pretty low F, really. And so it's not one or the other. It absolutely has to be both. So the church has an inward and an outward aspect to its mission. The inward part is us. It's caring for us, it's training us, teaching us to grow up in the likeness of Christ, equipping us for ministry. But there's also that outward component of building relationships with people who are far from Christ, serving them, loving them with the love of Christ, having spiritual conversations with them, and those who respond, winning them to a life-changing relationship with Christ. So in order for a church's structure to work, you've got to have clarity on what that mission is. Because if you don't know what your mission is, any structure will work as well as the next one. Because you're not sure what you're trying to accomplish. What you have been called to do as a local church is to make disciples. And that means more Christ followers, and that those followers are more Christ-like. In fact, really the most accurate way of saying it is, you've been called to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. In other words, it's not about being a disciple and sitting in the corner by yourself. It's about being a disciple who makes disciples. We should be reproducing the life of Christ in other people, rather than become depositories of the life of Christ and then wrap ourselves around that as though we're trying to hold it and guard it and protect it from other people. So there's my sermon on the mission. Well, at least the opening paragraph of a couple of sermons I have on the mission. Another thing is, for it to be effective, the structure must free rather than control. It must free rather than control. How many of you have been coming to this church more than 25 years? Okay, at least a third. How many of you have been coming between 12 and a half years and 24 and 11 months? Okay, several more. How many of you less than 10? And how many of you didn't get to raise your hand? Okay, we got everybody. Good. So if you go by that, you'll find that about a third have been here 25 or more. Looks like about 45% of y'all maybe have been here 10 or less. And then the other group between 15 and 25. Here's what I find. Oftentimes, the longer somebody attends a church, the more ownership they have in that church. Now, to me, that makes sense. Because when you attend a church and you become involved, it becomes central in your life. It's one of the more important things that you do. And so you wake up thinking about church stuff. When church stuff is shaky, you wake up feeling pit in your stomach. And when you go on Sunday and the church is going through a crisis, you go, I don't want to do this, but I got duty, I've got responsibility, I'm going to see us through this. Sometimes when we care about something so much, we smother it. I have a really good friend that I've known for, almost 50 years. It's my wife's best friend. And she has kind of smothered her 2 kids as a parent. They've got a new term out for parents who smother their kids. It used to be helicopter parent. Any of you ever heard that? Where the parent just kind of buzzes around the kid. Now they've got a version of that called lawnmower parents. Have you heard that?
Yeah.
A couple of you have. A lawnmower parent goes in front of their kid and mows down all the obstacles so their life is smooth sailing. And so that's what my wife's friend has done. Her 2 kids, she gets in the riding lawnmower and she goes in front of them and knocks everything out of the way. And in the process of doing that, she's actually exerting control instead of freeing them to lead. There was one of the first church consultants, a guy named Lyle Schaller. He was a city planner who became a church consultant. And he's passed away now. But when he was in his mid-80s, I took a class from him. And we had dinner one evening, and we were talking, and my kids were like high school, and somehow or another we got on kids. And he was saying, you can either give your kids wings or roots. But it's hard to give both in the same equal dosage. Roots, they normally stay close to home when they grow up. You give them wings, they get a good foundation, and they kind of go out on their own. Now, I wanted to give my kids roots and wings because I wanted them to stay close and have a good foundation. But one of my kids lives in Atlanta and the other one lives in Burbank. So, it's at least 8.5 hours to one, and it takes almost 8 hours to fly to Burbank if you stop anywhere along the way. And so what I found is you can either try to control your kids or you can set your kids free. But if you set them free, you want to give them a good foundation. Mm-hmm. I think church is a lot the same way. If you really love your church, don't smother it. Don't be a lawnmower church member. But you want to set it free. And you want it to have a good foundation, but you want to set it free to accomplish its mission. Newsflash. Ain't nobody in this room who died to create the church. Only Jesus did.
Amen.
Amen.
It's his. It's not mine as a state pastor. It's not Pastor Joe's as a pastor. It's not yours as a lay leader. It's God's. We call the church the body of Christ for a reason. It's his. And the biblical term for our role is steward. Stewards take a resource of someone else's and are entrusted to manage it according to the desires and wishes of the one who owns it. And so as leaders in the church, we have been entrusted with the resource of managing and leading the church for God's purposes, which are more disciples and better disciples. Now, a sobering moment for you as a leader. When your life on earth is over, then you appear at the pearly gates. The question will not be, do you love Jesus? God already knows the answer to that question. Okay? The question will be, as a leader in your local church, how did you help the church accomplish its mission? If your answer is, God, I made sure the pastor didn't do anything stupid, and I kept really tight reins on my church, so it didn't do much of anything, then it's going to be the same kind of response that that third steward who buried the money in the coffee can in the backyard got. You can come in, but I'm not happy. In fact, do you know there's a reference in 1 Corinthians